Hi everyone. In this tutorial, we're going to build a transaction-level financial analysis flow using Unified's accounting API. The goal is to compute three things of normalized ledger data, monthly actuals, a baseline budget, and Runway, all without branching logic depending on whether the customer is on QuickBooks, Xero, or NetSuite. By the end, you'll have a simple pipeline that pulls normalized ledger transactions with pagination, pulls the chart of accounts so you can classify spend, buckets transactions into month-level actuals, estimates baseline budgets using trailing averages, then fetches the latest balance sheet to compute Runway from cash on hand and burn. Everything here is plain Node, using the Unified TypeScript SDK. Start by creating a new project directory, initializing npm, and installing the Unified TypeScript SDK and .env. Then create a .env file with your Unified API key and the customer's accounting connection ID. That connection ID is what scopes every call to the customer's authorized accounting system. Next, load environment variables and then initialize the Unified SDK using your API key. From this point on, every accounting call is made through the SDK, and you just pass the connection ID for the customer you want to analyze. Before we start pulling data, it helps to be clear on the normalized objects we'll use. We'll work with four core entities: transactions, which are the lowest level ledger events and include a signed total amount; accounts, which label transactions via account ID and give us classification like expense, revenue, bank, and so on; organizations, which give us metadata like currency and fiscal year end; and balance sheets, which give point-in-time assets; and liabilities, so we can estimate cash on hand. The rest of the tutorial is just turning those objects into an analysis dataset. First, we fetch organizations. This gives us basic company metadata, and it also gives you a natural place to pick a primary org if the provider returns more than one. In the example, we just picked the first, but in a real product, you might let the user select which organization to analyze. Next, we fetch the chart of accounts. This step is critical because transactions on their own usually aren't enough for budgeting and Runway. The account type is what tells you whether a transaction represents expense, revenue, bank movement, and so on. We also index accounts by ID, so we can do O1 lookups later when we're processing transactions. Now we fetch transactions. This is the core dataset. We pull transaction level detail using pagination, so it works across large ledgers. You'll notice we keep this function generic with optional filters like updated GTE. That's what you'd use for incremental syncs in a production system. At this point, we have transactions and we can classify them via the accounts index. Now we build monthly expense actuals. The approach is straightforward. Convert each transaction timestamp into a year-month key, like 2026-01. Filter to expense accounts using the accounts index, and sum signed amounts per month per account. The result is a month bucketed matrix you can use for reporting, budget baselines, and burn calculations. Next, we estimate baseline budgets using trailing averages. We take the last n months of actuals, aggregate spend per account, and compute the average per month. This gives you a simple baseline budget per expense account that works even when you don't have an explicit budgeting feature in the customer's accounting system. Now we fetch the latest balance sheet and estimate cash on hand. The balance sheet gives us point-in-time assets. We filter those assets to accounts classified as bank and sum them to get a cash estimate. That's a pragmatic approach that tends to be robust across providers because we're using normalized account types instead of provider-specific logic. Finally, we wire it all together. We fetch organizations, accounts, and transactions, build monthly actuals, estimate budgets, fetch the latest balance sheet, compute cash on hand, and then compute Runway. For Runway, we estimate average monthly burn as the sum of the suggested budgets, then divide cash on hand by that burn rate. At the end, you can print the outputs or feed them into whatever analytics layer your product uses. From here, it's easy to extend the same dataset to things like spend by vendor, budgeting by account hierarchy, or more sophisticated burn calculations based on cash flow statements where supported. And that's it. You now have a transaction level analysis flow that works consistently across accounting providers, monthly actuals, a baseline budget, and Runway, all on top of Unified's normalized data. Thanks for watching, and check the blog post for the complete code.